Thank you very much for allowing me to share some St. Louis history today. It is truly an honor to be presenting in this hallowed space and be labeled as a historian by the Missouri Historical Society. My name is Bill Wickman, and as Emily said, and I would categorize myself as an amateur historian. And here are my credentials, also known as my great-grandparents. Albert Christian Frederick Wickman and Elizabeth Magdalena Eberlein Wickman moved to St. Louis from Germany by way of Ohio and Indiana in 1903. They moved into this house at 7116 Michigan Avenue in the Carondelet neighborhood, and it's still down there. And they moved into the house in 1904. So surely they went to the World's Fair. What qualifies me as a historian? Well, to put it simply, I love St. Louis history. I would contend that no American city has a more interesting history than St. Louis. Now, Dr. Sowell also makes that statement, but I'm older than he is, so I think I said it first. The problem with St. Louis history is there's just too much. You have to stay focused or you'll go mad. I'm going to stray somewhat from what my advertised program was today, Lucas and Garrison 1875, because it encompasses a body of research, and I want to use today to introduce the entire premise. And as Emily said, the journey started with some early St. Louis maps. Let's start with a quick St. Louis history refresher. The long-accepted theory has been that the city of St. Louis was founded in 1764 by French fur traders Pierre Laclede and Auguste Chouteau. That's what we St. Louisans learned in junior high civics class. But there's viable research that asserts that the village was occupied by the French long before Laclede and Chouteau were here. And of course, Native Americans were here for centuries, probably millennia before that. Here's a list of the Native Americans who lived in the St. Louis area. The city was named after King Louis IX of France. King Louis lived from 1215 to 1270 AD. He was crowned king when he was 11 years old, and he had 11 children. Hopefully that part of it happened somewhat after he was 11 years old. He was lived an exemplary life of virtue and prayer, and he was a great champion of the poor and was known for his charity. St. Louis could be named after a lot worse guys. As we all know, the city was established due to an ideal site on the bluffs just south of the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. In 1803, the United States acquired the territory known as the Louisiana Purchase from France for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase encompassed 530 million acres of land, and so that works out to about 3 cents per acre, so it was a really good deal. Trust me, this short map tour I'm going to take you on has a very clear destination. My interest in a specific era and a specific neighborhood in St. Louis began through the study of an amazing, impossible, fantastic, legendary map created in 1875. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that map later. But we'll start with some earlier maps and see what they tell us about our city. This might not be new for a lot of you, but it never hurts to revisit our roots. This research in building these presentations has led me to some themes and a question. The themes are attitude and legacy. So here's a question I want you to think about today as we look at these slides. How important was the city's attitude in determining the success of St. Louis and its legacy during the Golden Age? And might the relationship of those two concepts still apply today? So why are maps helpful in understanding St. Louis history? From the beginnings through the late 1800s, St. Louis experienced explosive growth. Maps reflect growth and prosperity in real and visible ways. St. Louis grew big and successful very rapidly, thanks both to immigration and the explosive western expansion of the country. Consider the difference between two 110-year periods in St. Louis history. In the first 110 years, from 1760 to 1870, St. Louis grew from 120 residents to 500,000 residents. In contrast, from 1910 through 2020, St. Louis's population declined from 822,000 people to just under 300,000. Quite a difference. In 1767, the village of St. Louis was slowly starting to become a town with 75 buildings and 300 inhabitants. Excuse me. It covered 3 blocks west of the Mississippi. And you can see on this rudimentary map that the plan was for a walled city with forts on the westernmost edge to protect against Indian attacks, or as my wife would correct me, Native American attacks. The city was laid out in a very orderly grid pattern, very French. The text on this map was rendered in a beautiful but very difficult to read handwritten 18th century script. It's also in French, as was appropriate for a French settlement in 1767. This map was redrawn in 1780. It states that it was from the original hand-drawn map created by Auguste Chouteau. History says that Chouteau had a very huge ego, and since his name did not appear anywhere in the initial map, it supports the premise that he did not actually draw that map. So, were Native Americans a real issue in the village of St. Louis in the late 1780s? This mural painted by Oscar E. Burninghouse is titled Indian Attack on the Village of St. Louis, 1780. The mural is displayed in the state capitol in Jefferson City, and here's the story behind the mural. The settlement was centered on what is now the Gateway Arch grounds. This is a great image to give us an idea how the city on the bluffs might have looked in 1780. The Battle of St. Louis was an attack instigated by the British on May 26, 1780, during the Revolutionary War. Native American tribes were bought off by the British to orchestrate the attack. It was an indigenous mercenaries who attacked us, if you will. The village of St. Louis was primarily a trading hub that was governed by the Spanish Lieutenant Governor Fernando de Leyva, a captain in the Spanish Army. Leyva was warned by a fur trader in late March of 1780 that the British were planning an attack on St. Louis. The British thought they could control the western United States if they occupied St. Louis and the Mississippi River's crucial supply routes. Leyva had previously developed a grand plan of defense that included the construction of 4 stone towers. By mid-May 1780, a single tower had been started but not completed. It was about 30 feet in diameter and 30 to 40 feet tall. The tower, dubbed Fort San Carlos, provided a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. There wasn't sufficient time to build more towers or a wall, so defensive trenches were dug between the tower and the rivers to the north and to the south of the village. Cannons were brought from another fort about 15 miles north, and Fort San Carlos was located at about 4th and Walnut, just northeast of the current Busch Stadium. And in 1780, that was the westernmost edge of the village. Long story short, thanks to the cannons and some French recruits from St. Genevieve, the citizenry was able to repel the attacks, and St. Louis was saved. Hooray! This 1822 historical cartographic image is part of the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection, a large body of online antique, rare, and historic maps. This very ornate map states plan for St. Louis, including late additions. It was engraved for Beck's Gazetteer in 1822. This graphic gives us a reference of where this map was located relative to our downtown today, and you can kind of see the bridges across the river to realize that it really was right on the arch grounds. The western edge of the village was at 8th Street again, and that would be just the west side of Busch Stadium. This map marked ancient works, and these were the mounds that were created by the ancient civilizations in St. Louis and southern Illinois area around 900 AD. Sadly, these historical relics and their archaeological remnants were not saved. They're another reminder that there were civilizations in our area long before 1764. This is a photograph of the big mound that was being leveled in 1869. This was a transitional period from a French mindset to an American overview. The street names on this map, which I realize you can't see, that are running north and south, were listed both with French and English names. And this map also depicts Wiggins Landing. There was no bridge at this point, so people, livestock, supplies, and everything else had to be ferried across the Mississippi. In 1844, the city had grown considerably and the maps had gotten a lot more informative. This colorful map shows the 6 original governmental wards of the city in 1844. The population of St. Louis in 1841 was 30,000, and the legend lists many points of interest in the city. Duncan's Island and Bloody Island are also shown in the Mississippi. But Bloody Island was where duels were fought to defend one's honor. Duels were illegal in Missouri. So if you're an Alexander Hamilton fan, Bloody Island for dueling here was kind of like Weehawken, New Jersey. Eventually, the Mississippi was rerouted, so the islands were eliminated from the riverfront in St. Louis. One of the most notable and final duels on Bloody Island was between 2 city luminaries, Thomas Hart Benton and Charles Lucas. And that's another great storyline for another day. This 1848 map includes a pleasant view of St. Louis from across the Mississippi and border illustrations of the many St. Louis landmarks during that period. You'll notice Choteau's Pond on the map. It was once a recreational retreat outside the city limits, but the city had quickly grown around it. What was once a tranquil spot for St. Louisans to escape from the city had now become a toxic sewer due to the uncontrolled dumping of everything you can imagine. The pond was drained after its suspected contribution to the cholera epidemic in 1849. It's estimated that 10% of the population of St. Louis died of the disease that year, so that would equal about 7,500 people. 1849 was a particularly bad year for St. Louis. On May 17th at 9 p.m., a fire alarm sounded, and the paddle wheel steamboat, the White Cloud, docked at the foot of Cherry Street, was set on fire by the embers of another passing steamboat. The moorings holding the White Cloud burned through, and the paddle boat floated downstream. It set the neighboring steamboat, Edward Bates, on fire, and the 2 burning boats drifted down the Mississippi, and they set 21 other steamboats and several flatboats and barges on fire. The wind was from the northeast that day and caused the flames to leap from the burning steamboats to the levee, congested with flammable goods, then to the buildings on shore. Soon, everything on the waterfront and the levee for 4 blocks was ablaze. The darkened area on this map shows the city blocks that were totally destroyed by the fire, and this included 430 buildings, along with the 23 steamboats. You can see the old cathedral as a reference to where this area was. The financial losses were devastating. The buildings that were destroyed were all wooden frame, and the fire changed the image of St. Louis. As new buildings rose up, they were constructed from locally produced brick, which has added to the beautiful architectural legacy which we still enjoy today. This 1854 lithograph titled View of St. Louis, Missouri by Emil B. Krause shows the continuing importance of the steamboat industry in St. Louis. This map was a nice sketch of the city, but not at all authentic. But that authenticity in St. Louis and its maps was about to change. James T. Palminteri traveled the upper Midwest as a printmaker specializing in oversized bird's eye views of cities. including this one of St. Louis in the 1850s. Using 4 large sheets of paper, he produced a bird's eye map that is 4.5 feet by almost 8 feet wide. This map is archived at the Historical Society Library and Research Center. It's not simply a facsimile of what St. Louis might have looked like in the 1850s, like the previous map. It's an accurate depiction of the city in great detail. Let's zoom in on this one section. Here's that section. You can read the names on the buildings at the top: the St. Louis Ice Company, the Machine Shop, and the Empire Works, and the names of the steamboats: the David Tatum, the Ocean Spray, the Morning Star, and the Edward Walsh. Really remarkable detail. This map was an amazing feat of research and artistry. Allow me to obsess a little bit more about the detail. Here's a blow-up of just one of those steamboats. How long might it have taken Palminteri to draw the David Tatum, just that one steamboat? The Palminteri map was on display at the Historical Society Library and Research Center in December of 2022. And it was really something worth seeing. By the year 1870, St. Louis proper was a growing city with a developing infrastructure, viable neighborhoods, and an exploding population. This map by Julius Hudowa shows the city limits stretching to just west of Grand Avenue. The city was subdivided into 12 wards, and all the streets can be located through their listings on a grid system. Beyond the city limits to the west, prairies are listed and subdivided by owners' names. These were the original city's common fields in the early days of the city, where people grew their produce and kept their livestock. This map is titled St. Louis and Environs 1870. During this era, many of the outlying cities, which are now in what we consider the county, were being established as villages along the newly developed train routes. You can see Webster, Kirkwood, Eureka, and Pacific were along the Pacific Railroad line, now the Missouri Pacific. Chesterfield was on the Fort Scott Railway, and St. Charles was on the St. Louis and Keokuk line. This map was developed to accompany a book titled St. Louis, the Fourth Great City of the World. The book was written by perhaps the greatest promoter of St. Louis who ever lived, Logan Uriah Rivas. Logan Uriah Rivas went few places when he did not command attention. More than his wild hair, flaming beard, his loud, off-putting manner, or his dirty, ill-fitting clothes, his frenzied agitation for the removal of the national capital from the District of Columbia to the Mississippi Valley got him notice. As a journalist, Rivas spent his formative newspaper years under the tutelage of the famed New York editor Horace Greeley. In 1866, he bought the St. Louis Daily Press and started an international crusade to move St. Louis from Washington, D.C. to move the U.S. capital from Washington, D.C. to St. Louis. He argued St. Louis was the center of the country and therefore the natural choice. In 1869, a convention was attended by the delegates from 21 states, and they met at the Mercantile Library downtown. The object was to urge Congress to make the move. Rivas contended that all of the federal buildings in Washington, D.C. should be dismantled stone by stone and reassembled in St. Louis. And although his idea failed, some believe that his books and promotion helped to build confidence in the city and attract many new residents from the East. This brings us to the most magnificent map of all. It's not even really a map, but an exhaustive piece of art, or really 110 pieces of art. It's these maps that were the motivation for my research, and that is what we'll concentrate on for the balance of this presentation. The 1875 Compton and Dry pictorial maps, and more specifically, Map Plate 71. You will be tired of me saying Map Plate 71 at some point. In 1875, Camille Noel Dry created and Richard J. Compton published a book which included an exhaustive set of 110 highly defined maps and commentaries titled 1875 Pictorial St. Louis, the Great Metropolis of the Mississippi Valley. The map-making project was monumental in its detail and accuracy. Do you remember the Palminteri map, which I just showed you a few minutes ago? Well, the Compton and Dry maps totally eclipsed that work. And as the immensity of the map project is examined today, you would have to say that the endeavor was impossible, except that the maps do exist. So I would like you to implant that word in your mind now, impossible, as we go through the next few slides. In 2015, as Emily said, the Missouri History Museum presented a wonderful exhibit based on these maps. The designer and editor and publisher of the maps was Richard J. Compton. His office was at the northwest corner of 6th and Locust, and he lived in Alton, Illinois, although during the production of the maps, he resided in the Planters Hotel in 1875. We don't know much about Mr. Compton today. He contributed much of the commentary to the maps, and that was a huge feat in itself. We do know a lot about Camille Noel Dry, who was the artist who drew the amazing maps. He was born on Christmas Day in 1842 on the Gold Coast of France. He received a diploma from the National Conservatory of Arts and Artisans in Paris in August of 1858, presumably in mechanical drawing. He came to the United States in August of 1864 during the height of the Civil War and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served as a draftsman until May 1865 when the war ended. His name disappeared for a while and then reappeared in July of 1870 when he married Carrie Bach of Louisiana. With his new bride and young son, Dry spent the next 3 years bouncing across 6 southern states, creating panoramic town maps. Dry's earliest maps show an artist still developing his skills, working through shaky understanding of perspective and aesthetic. His early maps show great technical ability, but they look flat and uninteresting. Here's his 1871 map of Galveston, Texas. He would hone his skills as he worked his way across the South in late 1872, drawing Charleston, South Carolina, and Macon and Augusta, Georgia. His single work in 1873 was a ship-based view of Norfolk, Virginia, and soon thereafter he headed to St. Louis for the biggest project of his career. In the early spring of 1874, Dry arrived in St. Louis to begin preliminary sketches for Pictorial St. Louis. Dry was a remarkably fast worker, but the enormous scale of Pictorial St. Louis was unlike anything he or anyone else had ever attempted. The Compton and Dry maps were drawn. I find this so hard to understand. The Compton and Dry maps were drawn with a grease pencil on lithographer stones so that they could be printed and published back then. Camille Dry could not have drawn Pictorial St. Louis alone, but had a team of artists working simultaneously. Just how many is not known, nor it is not known how they were organized. His team of artists went to incredible lengths to depict the city accurately, and that goal is noted in the book's introductory pages. Absolute truth and accuracy in the representation of the territory has been the standard. The finished map book sold for $25, which is the equivalent of $550 today. Many copies were sold through advanced subscriptions and newspaper advertisement, but the map's enormous price tag limited sales, and ultimately it was a financial wash. An original copy is housed at the Library and Research Center. After Pictorial St. Louis was published, Dry seemed to have suffered a severe case of cartographer's burnout. He made only 2 more panoramic maps, views of Anniston and Birmingham, Alabama, nearly 3 decades later in 1904. The work is dedicated to Captain James B. Eads, and the title page describes Eads, whose faith and skill as an engineer and noble qualities as a man has enabled him to accomplish results that have made St. Louis famous throughout the world, and endeared him in the hearts of the people of the Mississippi Valley. At the time, James Buchanan Eads lived on Compton Avenue near Henrietta and later in Lafayette Square. And as Emily mentioned, on May 7th, Amanda Clark is going to enlighten us more about James Eads and his bridge. The map book begins with a brief historical sketch of St. Louis. One of the joys of studying this era is the flowery and poetic way that writers expressed themselves back then to describe places, peoples, and times. The map book next includes several pages on statistics describing St. Louis in 1875. It was a time when our city was compared favorably to every city in the country and really the world. Consider St. Louis during this era. This is a photograph of Main Street looking south on Market in 1874. The buildings were many and impressive. Commerce was bustling. What's astounding is that in 1874, there was no electricity, gas streetlights were in their infancy, transportation and commerce were conducted from horse and buggy or mule-drawn trolleys on unpaved, muddy streets. There was no reliable sewer system. Clean running water was a luxury. The rich had indoor plumbing, but the water that flowed into their houses came directly, nearly unfiltered, from the Mississippi. And of course, the contents of their chamber pots eventually ended up right back in the Mississippi. Pollution and disease were the norms of the day. However, this was one of the richest and most dynamic eras in St. Louis's history, our golden age. But let's consider the real star of the publication, the maps. The maps are laid out on 110 pages or plates. Each map plate is 13 by 19 inches, and they were presented as a book. This key represents the book's layout. The book also included very interesting details about St. Louis in 1875 and profiles of local businesses, institutions, and people. By 1875, the city limits stretched to just about 1 block west of Forest Park and Skinker as it does today. And the 110 Compton and Dry plates covered 70 square miles in detail. 70 square miles. Every street, every building, every landscape feature, every architectural feature. Imagine how vast an area that is. 70 square miles. It's impossible. A compilation of the 110 maps is housed at the Mercantile Library at the University of Missouri St. Louis. It's 8 feet by 24 feet. Let's consider the realities of this project. I now have some work for you to do. This is a mental exercise to keep your brain sharp and awake. Consider it an imagination art project. I want you to think of your neighborhood and the house that you lived in that you thought about the most. What were the distinctive features of that architecture? The dimensions, the landscaping, and its relationship to adjoining properties. Now, imagine you're drawing that house. The more detail, the better, and almost good enough in accuracy is not good enough. The drawing needs to be an exact representation. And by the way, you need the drawing to be done from a bird's eye view with accurate perspective to your neighbors. How long would it take you to draw your house? How about your neighborhood? And how's your brain doing on this mental exercise? Here's a sketch of my last house. I'm a historian, not an artist. Now let's consider Camille Dry's drawings on the 1875 maps. Camille Dry didn't just have to accurately draw one building or one neighborhood. He set out to draw every street, every building, every landscape feature, and every architectural feature in St. Louis. And as he promised, he'd do it with absolute truth and accuracy in representation and territory. And let me reemphasize, 70 square miles. So how did he do it? Because of the remarkable, accurate perspective captured in the final drawings, it's thought that photographs were first taken. But remember, this was the early 1870s. Photography was very rudimentary by our sophisticated smartphone standards. The large 50 to 60 pound cameras needed the support of substantial tripods, and the photography needed long exposure times. Capturing that amount of data that he needed for the actual drawing would seem to take an impossible amount of time. For years it was thought that the photographs were taken in a hot air balloon suspended southeast of the city across the river over Illinois. But Andrew Wanko, the public archivist at the museum, refutes this theory for several reasons. First, try to imagine correctly exposing photographs in a swaying hot air balloon. Capturing good representations of buildings would be nearly impossible. No, it would be impossible. And here's a photograph he sent me of St. Louis in 1875. The air was filled with plumes of smoke billowing from every factory, home, train, and steamboat. The aerial view would have been quite worthless since the polluted air would obscure so much. Also, we have access to all of the many St. Louis newspapers printed in 1875. If a hot air balloon was hovering over the city for days on end, certainly there would have been a story in the papers, but no such story exists. So how did he do it? Every building would have had to have been examined separately on the ground, and when compared to early photographs of individual buildings, the accuracy is uncanny. The number and placement of windows, doors, decorative architecture is absolutely correct. This is map plate 73. Each of the 110 maps or plates contain an average of between 35 and 40 square blocks. Map plate 23. The detail on each building, the streets, parks, pedestrians, and vehicles is extraordinary. Map plate 22. Only a magnifying glass proves out the extent of the accuracy. Map plate 24. Each building is a work of art. Now consider drawing the entire city to cover how much area? 70 square miles. Here's an example. This is Wayman Crow's house at 603 Garrison Avenue on plate 71 in 1875. And here's Camille Dry's sketch blown up. How long would it take you to accurately draw this one house? And on the 13 by 9 inch map plates, which included the entire neighborhood, this house drawing is tiny, only about 1 inch by 1 inch. It's impossible. Back to my obsession about detail. Here's plate number 2 in the riverfront. Now let's zoom in on this portion of the plate. This shows the newly finished Eads Bridge, which was completed in 1874, as it comes ashore on the levee at the foot of Washington Avenue. Look at the detail of the buildings, the riverboats, unloaded cargo on the levee, people, horses, carts, carriages, a dog. And look at the buildings. These aren't just random depictions of any old buildings. They're the actual, accurately drawn buildings that were located on the riverfront in 1875. This one segment is a work of art, and an accurate work of art at that. This blow-up depicts about 1/4 of the area of map plate number 2. Remember, there were 110 maps. So this one drawing is 1/440th of the entire map that Dry drew. It's impossible. You may have noticed that each of the maps includes a list of some of the businesses and residences that were located on that specific plate. The list is numbered and the buildings were marked with tiny little numbers which coincide with the list, so we know exactly where they were on the map. It's thought that the people were able to include themselves on the list as sponsors of the project. The accuracy is also amazing and can be verified comparing them to the 1875 Gould's Directory of St. Louis. This was the phone book from that era, except that they didn't have phones yet. The first telephone did not appear in St. Louis until 1878 with 12 subscribers. Imagine the task of compiling the resident and business list and then earmarking each location on the 110 maps. Impossible. During the time that Camille Dry was working on the project in St. Louis, he was also living in it. According to the Gould 1875 street directory, he worked from room 48 at 414 Olive Street, and his home was at 715 Locust, here highlighted in blue on plate 21. So, what's the historical intrigue of all of this? My interest is now morphed into an exhaustive, obsessive research project called Lucas and Garrison 1875, an intersection of St. Louis lives, times, and places. The Lucas and Garrison project is all about focusing on just one of the Compton and Dry 110 maps and trying to find out all that I can about that area and the people who lived there in 1875. I chose plate 71. Why? Well, I was doing a research project on the history of Central Presbyterian Church, and I wanted to track down where the church was located when the Compton and Dry maps were created. Interestingly, the second location of the church, which was started in 1844, was at 8th and Locust, right across the street from where Camille Dry lived. The church had been condemned in 1874 because the foundation was damaged. The foundation damage was caused by the excavation of a tunnel connecting the newly finished Eads Bridge with the warehouse district, which is now located about where Busch Stadium is. So a magnificent new church building was being built 22 blocks west at the corner of Lucas and Garrison on plate 71. Here's a closer look at Dry's sketch, including the church on map plate 71. Oh, and by the way, here's the home of Wayman Crowe that we looked at earlier. The church is number 88 on the list at the bottom of the plate. This is architect Charles Ramsey's initial rendering of the church, and this is another rabbit trail. When the maps were drawn, the church had not yet been completed, but Dry included it on his map from a different perspective based on this rendering. How long would that have taken? Unfortunately, due to monetary constraints, the beautiful spires were never completed, and here's a photo of the spireless church in the early 1900s. Map plate 71 on today's map of St. Louis is in the area we call Midtown, about halfway between the river and Forest Park, north of Harris Stowe State University and east of St. Louis University. On today's map, Lucas Avenue is now Samuel Shepherd Avenue, named after a famed African-American educator. Take in this map plate. In 1875, the Lucas and Garrison neighborhood was a robust, densely populated part of the city. Here's where the intrigue comes in. Sadly, not a single building depicted on map plate 71 150 years ago still exists today. Not one. And I did not recognize a single resident in the 104 names listed at the bottom of the map. So this is where my quest began. Who were these people? And what was their contribution to the city of St. Louis? This Lucas and Garrison research is not unlike an archaeological dig in search of a lost civilization. I located and tagged each of the 104 buildings listed on the bottom of plate 71. I then took the list of residents and plotted their location on a street layout grid and subdivided them into 7 color-coded groups. Can you see number 88? That was the location of Central Presbyterian Church at the northeast corner of Lucas and Garrison, the epicenter of this project. Each resident's name and address can be validated using the 1875 Gould Street Guide. The street names are noted on the grid with house number blocks, and the house number blocks are also designated. The premise of this research project, again, is this: who are these people? What are their stories? And what can we learn from their lives? So far, I've unearthed some remarkable historical storylines and many equally interesting rabbit trails. Here's a foretaste of the research and many of the additional presentations going forward. Consider just consider just one Plate 71 resident, our friend Wayman Crowe. He lived at 603 Garrison Avenue. How many of you ever heard of Wayman Crowe? That's what I thought. He was born in Hartford, Kentucky, was educated in a rude one-room log cabin with mud floors. At the age of 12, he began apprenticing at a dry goods store in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and was so proficient in his work that at 15 he was entrusted with control of the entire business. At 21 he married, and in 1835 he moved to St. Louis. He continued in the dry goods business, and eventually Crowe, Hargadine and Company became one of the largest commercial houses in St. Louis. Here's Plate 21, which includes Crowe, Hargadine and Company's building on 6th and Washington in 1875. And to give you perspective, I've got the old courthouse circled too. To make a very long story short, in 1840, Crowe was unanimously elected president of the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce. He was then elected to the Missouri State Senate. Wayman Crowe, along with William Greenleaf Eliot, founded Washington University. He founded Washington University. When Crowe's son and his namesake died, he founded the St. Louis Museum of Fine Arts on 19th and Locust to memorialize him. That is the genesis of our art museum today. He founded the St. Louis Art Museum. And this is only a few of the many contributions he made to our city. Crowe's biographer wrote, "Mr. Crowe is a man of eminent usefulness. For his honorable services in mercantile life, in political trusts, in public enterprises, in educational work, and in private charity, St. Louis will long cherish the memory of its distinguished benefactor." And yet, he is scarcely remembered at all, much less cherished. So I'm overwhelmed by the remarkable number of residents living on Plate 71 in 1875 who lived significant, fascinating lives. Their stories need to be told. So over the next months and years, I hope to be able to share some of these stories with you. They are an important part of the amazing legacy of our city, and they are part of who we are as St. Louis. I'm going to finish today with a document and one more map. I found an enlightening article that speaks to St. Louis's attitude at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The document was published in the World's Fair Bulletin. This was a monthly, this was a monthly 44-page publication that covered every element of news about the fairs, people, planning, construction in great detail. The defining passage, which I'm going to share, is from a World's Fair Bulletin published not after the fair was completed. This passage included and was on the first page of the first editions published in November of 1901. As I clear my throat and read, as I read, consider our city's attitude. The readiness with which the people of St. Louis raised a private subscription of $5 million to start the World's Fair movement, to start the World's Fair movement, the remarkable unanimity with which, by popular vote, they authorized their municipality to subscribe $5 million more, and the recent polling of 5/6 of the total vote for the necessary charter amendments ought to convince the outside world that in matters pertaining to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, St. Louis knows no such word as fail, that she knows what must be done and how to do it, and does it straight along without the faintest sign of hesitation. These charter amendments were not framed or adopted to secure the success of the World's Fair, because the people were already assured of that. and desired to put their city in a condition to derive the greatest possible benefit therefrom. When every one of the 28 wards united in such remarkable spectacle of municipal unanimity, it was because they felt it was incumbent on them to make their city itself one of the most attractive of the fair's exhibits, to present her in the true light to crowds representing the best citizenship of the whole world, to let them see that she is conscious of her mission and proud of it, and so that the people of the great Mississippi Valley may point with pride to their metropolis as a worthy representative of their civilization and the dignity of their grand domain. Remarkable civic pride and confidence. Attitude and legacy. The turn of the century was the peak of St. Louis's prosperity and success. The citizenry believed they were destined to be one of the greatest cities of the world. They had big dreams and took big risks, believing that there was nothing they couldn't accomplish if they embraced a common objective, worked together, and set their focus on getting it done. They were rewarded by pulling off one of the most ambitious endeavors ever attempted. St. Louisans set their sights impossibly high. They committed the necessary time, energy, and resources, and most importantly, believed they can do it, and they did. This map on the screen is from 1907 and is entitled The Heart of St. Louis. What I want to emphasize is the four corner emblems. The top left and right are the U.S. seal and the Missouri State seal. The lower seal on the left states, "To the front, St. Louis." And the lower seat on the right says, "Nothing impossible," the guiding spirit of our city. Attitude and legacy. Are there any lessons we can learn from this today? What if today the city of St. Louis, our city, adopted that kind of huge defining attitude? What if we all again adopted a mindset that success was inevitable? If we work together, nothing is impossible. There are certainly plenty of big challenges to overcome in St. Louis. What if we decided to unite as a community and take them on? What if, attitude and legacy. The people's attitude during the late 19th and early 20th centuries had a profound impact on St. Louis's legacy in the world. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if we could change our attitude about this city and make great things happen again? What if? So that's the plan. I'm digging deep into the lives of the forgotten people who lived on Plate 71 in 1875 to rediscover and tell their stories and how their lives impacted St. Louis. To date, I've finished 4 additional presentations, and I'm working on the 5th. The potential for many more stories is seemingly unlimited. There are important St. Louis historical storylines from a fascinating time and place. The next presentation in this series is the Garrison Avenue 9, which tells the amazing stories of 9 neighbors listed on Plate 71. Now, if you like St. Louis history, but you're not particularly interested in the people who lived on Plate 71 in 1875, I'm okay with that. There are 109 other Compton and Dry map plates, and you can call any one of them your very own. Thanks for your attention.